Our guest today is an Irish woman who's enjoying considerable international success in her business career. Anita Sands, PhD, is a US-based corporate board director who currently serves on 3 public companies and 2 private company boards in the technology, real estate and financial services sectors. She's a former Fulbright scholar. She holds a PhD in atomic and molecular physics and a master's in public policy and management. And she's the incoming James Wee Visiting Professor in Entrepreneurship at Princeton University and is also a contributor to Forbes on leadership and strategy. During her career, she says she has enjoyed what she calls a number of pivots. Firstly, from physics into public policy, then from academia into financial services, and finally, or at least for now, from technology to the boardroom. She spent a decade in financial services and C-suite positions before pivoting into technology, where she spent the past 7 years working alongside some of the world's best CEOs. And she writes and speaks internationally on topics such as technology, diversity, and leadership in the digital age. Anita, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
Hi, Matt. Good afternoon to everybody in Dublin. So lovely to be with you.
Now, to start, just tell me, please, a little bit maybe about where you are now, the 3 public companies on whose boards you serve and what you bring to them.
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate, some great, interesting endeavors in my portfolio. Right now, I'm on the board of a company called ServiceNow, which is the world's leading enterprise SaaS company in the workflow space. So very much in the same realm as Salesforce.com and Workday, those types of companies. I'm also on the board of a company called Pure Storage, which provides flash storage for the enterprise. So very much kind of cutting edge in terms of the future of infrastructure and data centers. And the other public company I serve on is a company called iStar, which is in the corporate real estate business here, based out of New York. And they're actually looking to revolutionize the corporate real estate world vis-a-vis ground leases, which is quite a new business here in the United States. So they're my public boards. The 2 private boards are also very exciting. One of them is a company called Nubank, which is in Brazil. It's the world's largest, or it's Latin America's largest digital neobank. So very much upending kind of all the incumbents in the banking sector. Fascinating company to be involved with. And I think, Matt, in terms of what I bring to the equation, it's that sort of mixture of, as you mentioned in my background, I've done quite a range of things. And I think the art of being a good director is asking the right question at the right time and the right tone. So having a range of things in your background that you can draw upon to frame those questions and to open up the dialogue in the boardroom, it's serving me well thus far.
Indeed it is. And that's an absolutely fascinating range of different interests that you actually have to cover. How difficult is it to be on top of all those different types of businesses and technologies?
Well, you know, it's fascinating, Matt. It's what I love about the job, to be honest with you. I mean, I didn't necessarily anticipate moving into a portfolio career as early on in my life as I did. But then I found that it really plays to my skill set and my strengths, which is sort of, you know, my breadth is my depth, as I like to say. But I also was very purposeful, Matt, insofar as I think it's important for every director to think about the value proposition you bring to the boardroom. And for me, I was very clear that I was going to be a board director who majored in bringing the future into the present. A lot of directors come to the table with 30 years of experience and they're trading on that past experience and the depth of that to bring value to the dialogue. And I recognized very early on that's not the value that I bring. That's not my profile. Instead, I'm going to always be committed to looking ahead, looking around the corner, wondering what these companies will be coming up against, staying current on what's going on in all of these industries, and then trying to bring that kind of more forward-looking perspective into the room. And as I like to say, good directors provide the right balance of oversight, insight and foresight when they come to the meetings.
But does that mean that you're not intimately involved now with the day-to-day running of any particular business, that what you do is provide that degree of oversight at a range of business?
Yeah, that's right, Matt. And I think that's actually an important distinction for us sort of non-exec directors, NEDs, as we're better known in Ireland and the UK. You know, they say that being a director is about sort of, nose in and fingers out, right? You actually have to remind yourself that you are not there to run the company. You are there to provide guidance and advice and to try to challenge management to make the best decisions that they can. But I love some of the CEOs I've worked with. Whenever board members would be crossing over that line and getting into the operational details, one of them would always say, I just need you all to put your screwdrivers back in your back pockets, please. You're not here to tinker with the engine. So it's actually an interesting distinction to find yourself on that side of the fence versus sort of those of us who are used to coming out of operating roles. It's a different, as I say to these CEOs, like, we're on the same team, we just play different positions. So you got to remember what your position is.
I've been reading some of your writing recently in Forbes. There's some fascinating stuff there. And you've been writing a lot about cognitive diversity recently. Tell us a little bit about your own particular career path to get to where you are, because that certainly seems to indicate quite a lot of cognitive diversity. How did you go from physics to the boardroom?
Thanks, Matt. Thank you. Gosh, this could be a good conversation for over a few pints. Look, I would love to say it was all very well architected and designed, but like most things in life, there was an element of serendipity as well. I would say the thread that kind of connects it all, though, Matt, is I really do have a fairly insatiable curiosity and an interest in a broad range of things. I started out as a physicist at the Queen's University of Belfast, as you pointed out, and I loved physics in secondary school. You know, I was either going to study physics or economics, and so I did my 6 years there, my undergrad in physics and applied math, and then my PhD in atomic and molecular physics. But I decided halfway through my PhD I wasn't destined to be a research scientist for life, but I was fascinated in the impact that science and technology were having in the world. And I thought that there weren't enough people who kind of could speak both languages, right? People who came from a scientific background, who understood policy, and people who worked in the policy realm who had enough scientific depth in their backgrounds. And I really do feel, as my career has sort of progressed and I've traversed multiple disciplines and multiple industries, there's tremendous value to those who can kind of unlock the value between two seams. People who can speak sort of multiple languages because they've spent time in multiple industries. So I think all of that is sort of part of my value proposition. But increasingly, with the pace of change being what it is, Matt, the half-life of our skill sets is getting shorter and shorter. So all of us kind of have to commit to a lifelong journey of continuous learning and upskilling and curiosity. So I'm glad that that's been a hallmark of my path thus far, and I hope it will continue to be.
I know you're very, very interested in the whole concept of leadership. And one line that you wrote recently, which I thought was fascinating and I'd like you to elaborate upon, was the best lead when the plan falls apart. And I think for many, many people in business, because of what's happened with COVID in 2020, the plans have fallen apart. So tell us what you think is required in a leader at a time like this.
Yeah, Matt, it's just such a great question. And leader in every realm, in public sector, private sector, sort of the conditions of this year have really been truly unprecedented. It was very clear to me, Matt, this year that, I was spending time in boardrooms in Silicon Valley, and you think of Silicon Valley as being an epicenter bastion of disruption. And, we kind of prided ourselves on being disruptors across a broad range of industries. And yet then, as this sort of pandemic hit and the crisis unfolded, it was very clear that people around me were feeling incredibly disrupted, but in a different way. So that caused me to step back and say, what is different about the conditions of this year? And what became evident is that this wasn't disruption as we would traditionally think about it in business. This was a case of acute ambiguity. So the best way that I describe that, Matt, is like you could have decision-making frameworks that would help you decide on which hook you want to hang your hat. But where do you decide, how do you decide where to hang your hat in the absence of any hooks? That's sort of the difference. So it calls for a very different type of leadership and a different type of skill set. But primarily some of the skills that are going to be required going forward, Matt, which this year has made, sort of acutely evident. One is learning agility, right? We need leaders that have the ability to learn quickly, to ask the right questions, and quite frankly, who have the humility and the courage to be vulnerable and recognize that, no, I don't have all the answers here. And by definition, in a world where you are facing unprecedented conditions, your prior experience can only get you so far, because if this is unprecedented, then nobody's dealt with it. So it's then going to be a case of people who can respond with agility, who can ask the right questions, who can remain open-minded and curious enough to allow emergent answers to unfold. And particularly going back to the point around cognitive diversity, you're looking for leaders who can put a team of people together who do represent a diverse range of perspectives, and then who sort of lean into those differing perspectives to get the most strategic view of what is going on. So one way to put it, Matt, is, if you're on a battlefield, it doesn't help if everybody on your team looks at the problem through the same set of binoculars. You want people to bring various perspectives. So I think you're really looking for leaders with that type of learning agility, leaders who can sort of manage the polarities between, say in this year, vulnerability and empathy for employees with kind of courage and strength, or strategic vision and a view of the North Star, but yet being willing to pivot and modify as the conditions require. So it's sort of I think in some respects, a very different type of leader is starting to emerge. And what's clear to me is that where we go and find these leaders from is not going to be the same as it was in the past. These sort of career paths of working your way up through the ranks of an organization to get to the C-suite and then be a CEO successor, that is only one path. But if you think about, say, the story of GE and how they traditionally would have selected their leaders very much from these internal succession paths, it's not clear that that will necessarily save or serve all of these incumbent companies very well in the future when these different types of skill sets are required. So it's a fascinating time for boards, because of course one of the things that we are charged with most is selecting the CEO and choosing the right leader for the future.
It's very interesting you use GE as an example, given the disruption of value that has taken place in the last 20 years with the transition from Jack Welch to Jeff Immelt and beyond. But I am interested as well about being present. I think this is something else you've written about, that leaders may not be able to say they have all the answers at present, but they have to be there projecting a degree of positivity while also be realistic. Talk a little bit more about that.
That's right, particularly in times of crisis. So what happens, Matt, in a crisis or acute uncertainty, and look, we've all felt this in our personal lives, right? You see it even across your family. When people feel anxious or uncertain, or they sense sort of the ground is shaky beneath their feet, fears can kind of metastasize in their minds, right? And those anxieties can take on sort of a life of their own. So it's incredibly important for a leader to show up, be present, as you rightly say, confront the reality that the team is facing right now, and to do so with a balance of pragmatism and realism to recognize what is happening, but also to bring in the appropriate dosage of hope and optimism, because that is what orientates people towards the change in a way that's very constructive and positive. And I think a lot of leaders felt that, I shouldn't go out and do an all hands meeting or a town hall with my employees when I have all the answers. But at times like this, those that we've experienced this year, people want to see that their leaders are there, they're visible, they are empathetic to what's going on, they're giving the best transparent information that they can at the point in time, and that they're being very authentic in how they do that. If you try and orchestrate your presence in a time when people are feeling acute uncertainty and distress, they can smell that from 1,000 miles away. So hugely important to be visible, to be communicative, to be transparent, and most of all, to be authentic as a leader at times like this.
You also write a lot about resilience and the requirement not to bounce back, as a lot of people say you need to do at a time like this, but bounce forward. So define resilience for me in a corporate world or in a business setting, and explain the difference as you see it between bouncing back and bouncing forward.
Yeah, well, the thing about like acute ambiguity and the pace of change. I mean, I love Justin Trudeau had this wonderful line that he used at Davos a couple of years ago, and he said, the pace of change has never been this fast and will never be this slow again. And I think that is particularly true. Change happens faster in times of change. So to be resilient, there's no point in trying to bounce back to something that no longer exists because things are changing so rapidly. We always want to equip ourselves with the ability to bounce forward and to bounce upward. So as a business leader, what that looks like in my mind, Matt, is to think about how can I bend the curve for my company as we're coming out of this crisis? How can I move my team from a point of not just enduring what we are going through or even performing and getting to the end of the year with reasonable results, but actually conditioning people to thrive in conditions where things are perpetually changing and are uncertain. So that was the question that I posed this year, Matt. And the challenge I would put to all of the aspiring leaders who are listening today and all these terrific entrepreneurs that we've heard from is, I remember reading this a phenomenal story about a Harvard professor. She wrote a book, and actually this was a story in the acknowledgement section. And she was midway through writing this book that took her 10 years. And halfway through, her house went on fire. And she describes in the acknowledgements how the night of the blaze, she ran around trying to close every door in her house that she could to stop the spread of the blaze. And later that night, as she stood outside with her family, with her home entirely engulfed in flames, she said, you know, it never occurred to me that I was closing doors to rooms that would no longer exist. And that just hit me, Matt, in the gut. I've never, ever been able to forget that story since. And I've used it in all of my boardrooms and a lot of conversations like this, because as leaders in times of ambiguity, if you want to be resilient, you have to think about, are you spending your time opening doors to rooms that might exist in the future, creating those rooms perhaps, or are you spending your time really on rear view mirror rooms that kind of might not exist in the future? So to me, resilience is not about bouncing back to where you once were. It is not about going through a period of change and coming out of it remaining the same and unchanged. It's not about grieving everything that you've lost. It's about, you know, thinking about the world of things you stand to gain here. It's about, you know, how can I allow these changes to occur to me, absorb these learnings, and then come out of this wiser, more evolved, morphed, changed as a business. And just to kind of bring it back, Matt, to your specific questions about leaders, we are seeing, and this is an evident point, right? Times like this are when seismic dislocations occur in industries, right? Like, who would ever have imagined that one of the chief competitors to Aer Lingus or to United Airlines would be Zoom? I mean, it's just like the world is upside down right now. So you see these seismic dislocations, and it's critical, therefore, that leaders, you know, have the ability to pivot and to react and not to kind of stay tied to or weighed down by the incumbency of the past or any of the assumptions that were inherently embedded in their business model or their strategic planning in the past either. So to me, that's what resilience is. It's about the ability to absorb what's happening, be aware, as you say, and then react and respond appropriately so that you can take advantages of the disruption and not be a victim of it.
Indeed, you've written about developing a model for thriving in ambiguity, the ABCD model. You've touched, I think, on the awareness, but take us through the other parts of it.
Yeah, Matt, it's sort of Sesame Street simple, ABCD. I kind of, you know, you need these models to be memorable, if nothing else. So awareness is very much what you said. It's about understanding on an individual level, self-awareness. How did this crisis find me? How has it affected me? What are my strengths that I can draw on? What are my triggers? What replenishes me as a leader? So important as we head into the holiday season to know what is it that depletes you and what is it that replenishes you, and focus on that. And then the other element of awareness is strategic awareness, which we've talked about earlier, this ability to bring a broad range of perspectives to the table and to leverage that to gain strategic awareness of the context as it unfolds, right? So it's a very dynamic process. The B is belonging. And what that means, Matt, is at times of crisis, for every single one of our employees, right? We were all in these routines and rituals. Now we're all working from home. And even the most loyal of employees start to ask this existential question of, what's holding me here? Did I like what I was doing? Or has this crisis kind of shown that, no, something, it's more important to be closer to my parents. It's more important to have flexibility to be able to pick my kids up from school. There's just things that have surfaced in my life that are a higher priority. So employees need to feel this bond of belonging to the company, to the purpose, to the mission, in order to sort of, be tied in and to stay engaged in conditions of duress and stress. So the way I describe belonging in a nutshell, Matt, is belonging to employees at times like this is like gravity to an astronaut. If they don't feel it, if it's not there, they run the risk of breaking apart. And what we know about high-performing teams, who thrive in ambiguity, they really see belonging as central to their success, because these are conditions where you feel accepted, you feel trusted, you can trust your boss to have your back. You know that the mission of the company is important. You know that the values of the company is aligned with are aligned with your values. And you know that this is a place where you feel nurtured and stretched. So basically, work for people who have this strong sense of belonging, work is something that replenishes them and provides support, not something that drains them. So it's really essential, actually, as an element of resilience. C, I've already touched on as well, that's curiosity. And curiosity is what allows you to orientate towards change in a completely different way. Curiosity gets you out of that fight, flight, freeze mode. In fact, physiologically, it's impossible for your brain to be in curiosity mode and in fight, flight, freeze. So it has a huge amount of sort of emotional benefits. Cognitively, curiosity leaves you exploring for longer, allows you to manage risks better, allows you to see resources differently. It allows you to find yourself ways out of corners that you're jammed into. So curiosity is actually a superpower, to be honest with you, at an individual and an organizational level at times like this. And then drive, probably my favorite letter of all, Matt. Drive, and again, this is coming from a study of elite teams who thrive in ambiguity. Drive is about being unapologetic about certain things. And most importantly, being unapologetic about the need for rest and recovery and respite. Knowing that you have to pause, you have to slow down, you have to take a bit of a time out to sort of just get your feet underneath you again, feel that sense of equilibrium, do what it is that replenishes you in order to come back and to be at your best when your best is needed. That is not every hour of every day. It's some hours of some days. So these elite teams know that there's sort of an oscillation between when you're in sort of full drive and when you can afford to be idling a little bit. They're also really, really conscious about who they engage in what and in what way. So let me explain why this is so important for leaders right now if we want to build resilience into our teams. Everybody is kind of depleted by the conditions and the circumstances of their lives. So now is not a time to ask your employees to do any superfluous, unnecessary work. Now is a time as a manager to be rigorous in prioritizing what you get people to do, to cut out all of the white noise, and to re-engage and engage them in their work in a way that has a far higher degree of intent, Matt, and intentionality than we normally invoke in the corporate world. Let me give you a very tangible example. I was on a board call last week, an audit committee call. There were 16 people from management and from the company on the call with us, and 6 of them spoke in the duration of the 2-hour call. So I'm sitting there going, I don't know why these other 10 people needed to be on this call, but I don't think that was a purposeful, intentional, meaningful engagement for them or a good use of their time. So particularly in this era of Zoom, when it is very easy just to throw everybody on every call, I think we even need to be more purposeful about who we engage in what and in what way. So that's A, B, C, and D. And combined, Matt, they're a process. They're not just sort of a one and done thing. There's sort of a process that you keep sort of circling through in order to build resilience at an individual team and organizational level.
Anita, something else I read that you quoted recently, which hadn't struck me before, but very interesting, and I think would be very interesting to the people who have been involved in making the presentations today and who are watching this. You said, nothing can prepare you for the loneliness of leadership, but I think entrepreneurship is the loneliest journey of all. Tell me a little bit more about why you say that.
Absolutely. Oh, it's so true, Matt. And, I really, really deeply admire entrepreneurs for the skill sets they have, for the optimism they bring, and for the role they play in our society. We wouldn't be anywhere without them. So to all of you that are out there, when you have those moments of doubt, keep going because we need you to do what you do and be your best. Any CEO finds that it is an incredibly lonely seat. There's not that many people you can talk to. There's not that many people that can empathize with the seat and the conditions you're in. The puck stops with you, or whatever that expression is. The buck stops with you, like literally every minute of the day. Your board are there for you, but it's not everything that you want to reveal to your board all of the time if you are having doubts or uncertainties about certain things. So that's a relationship that is helpful to a degree. Your team, of course, are there for you, but again, you're there to lead the team, so you can't always reveal the depths of your fears or your insecurities to your team. So it sort of creates this condition of loneliness. One of the things that's and for entrepreneurs, Matt, in particular, they are not only in that seat, but they're in these conditions of incredible ambiguity all of the time, right? You are dealing with the unknown. You are sort of stepping into an unfolding journey. You're creating that journey with others. So there's just, I think, on one hand, tremendous excitement. And for great entrepreneurs, that's what fires them up. And that's what they love, and that's why they do it. But, it's not to say it's easy. It certainly isn't. So one of the things I really encourage everybody to think about, if you could imagine a leader standing on top of a mountain, sort of at this lonely peak, the only person who's really going to share his vantage point is a guy or a gal who's standing on the top of the next mountain over, equally high up, equally looking down, and can empathize with that position. So we're a great believer in some of the companies I work with, Matt, and across sort of my consulting organization, Propel Performance Group, in sort of peer-to-peer CEO entrepreneur kind of cohorts, learning cohorts. These are trusted groups of peers where you can come together, Chatham House rules, and talk about the conditions and the experiences that you are having together. And not only is that helpful because it prevents you from reinventing the wheel for yourself every single time, but it is also one of the very few ways in which entrepreneurs and CEOs can build their self-efficacy, because it's incredibly grounding and rewarding and enriching to see how your strengths and your wisdom is enabling somebody else and is helpful to somebody else at a peer level. So I'm just a great believer, and I encourage anybody who's on the call today to continue to build this terrific network across each other, and to have each other as peers and friends, because that is one way you mitigate the loneliness of that particular job.
There is one other topic I want to discuss with you, because you have also written very persuasively about diversity being an economic issue as much as maybe a social or ethical one, because it's a way to make sure that companies get the best financial return by having all of the voices that diversity can contribute to management. But yet, are you still in a situation whereby you're one of the few females who has multiple board positions in corporate America? And indeed, that's something that's often replicated throughout the Western world.
Yeah, there's no question, Matt, we've made some progress in terms of, particularly at the board level, relative to diversity and specifically gender diversity. That's been enabled by, California, for example, has a couple of new pieces of legislation that mandates sort of certain percentage of publicly traded companies, getting to sort of diverse representation in the boardroom. It is but as I want to be clear, Matt, good is not perfect and better is not equal. We are nowhere close to equality. There's a few things fundamentally wrong with the board situation in particular. I've argued for a long time that it's not a supply side problem. There's ample amounts of well-qualified women who could sit in boardrooms. It's a demand-side process problem, in part driven by the fact that most board recruiting starts with, who do you know who'd be great around this room and around this table in this room? And of course, all of our networks tend to look like people who are like us. So that sort of just perpetuates the problem. So there's a lot that needs to be done at the board level, and a lot that can be done, I think, quite effectively. The reason I am such a strong proponent of diversity is not because I think it's a nice thing to do or the right thing to do. If my job, Matt, as a director, is to protect the long-term interests of shareholders. And quite frankly, I don't see any way of doing that unless we are drawing on the skills and the perspectives of a broad range of people, a diverse range of people with a diverse range of experiences. And particularly in the tech sector where I work, if you think about the impact of technology in the future, if we only harness a subset of the world's skills and insights and and the percentage of the population, I kind of feel like we're putting humanity on a plane that's only flying on one wing. And if you look on, industries in the, say in the United States, I'll give you the statistics here. You take AI, only about 20–25% of the jobs in AI are held by women. Only 2 to 4%, depending on what study you look at, of the tech industry is made up of Hispanic or Black employees. Now, that to me spells a major problem, because the platforms and the capabilities that this industry is building is not just a set of tools. Like this is the foundation upon which humanity as a digital species will exist. And therefore, those capabilities, tools, platforms, systems have to be created by everybody for everybody. So I feel that it's a business imperative, it's critical, but I also think, just to bring it back, Matt, to more of an Irish context where it isn't just about ethnic diversity. One of the things we do badly is we define diversity very poorly. We tend to sort of hone in immediately on variables such as gender or race. But as I like to remind people, there are a lot of things that go into shaping your worldview. If you grow up in County Louth, you're going to have a different perspective than somebody that maybe grew up in Cork or Dublin, right? If you grow up in a sort of one set of socioeconomic conditions, that shapes your perspective on the world, versus if you grow up, say, in a very elite set of conditions. So there are a lot of things that go into how we think about life, how we look at the world, and the perspective we bring. And one of them, for instance, Matt, that I think is applicable is age, right? 91% of people say that they have experienced some form of age discrimination at some point in their career. They were told they were a bit young for something, they were told they were a little old for something, and yet only 6 to 8% of diversity strategies include age as a variable. So just stepping back from this again is about how do you build a team, a leadership team and a team that reflects the broad perspectives, skills and talents of the world, and how can you harness those so that your business has a competitive advantage. And I don't know about you, Matt, but after a year like this, I would lock on to any potential source of competitive advantage that I could garner, and I think having a diverse team is certainly one of them.
Anita, there is so much more that I could ask you about, but unfortunately we've run out of time. It is tremendous to see somebody from County Louth having so much success across a range of disciplines in business in the United States and indeed further afield. And your writings in relation to management and diversity and directorships are also fascinating, and I would recommend them to anybody on the Forbes website to check out. It's been great having you with us. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
Thoughtful questions, and don't forget, President Biden comes from Louth as well, so Louth and proud. We'll keep on all the way.
Comes from Louth and a bit of Mayo as well, that I'm sure anyone in Mayo will tell us also. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us at the Big Ideas today.